My number 4 best chess game of the 1990s is Vasyl Ivanchuk versus Alexey Shirov from Wykenze 1996. Now, to my knowledge, these are the only 2 chess players who have planets named after them, as both Planet Chucky and Planet Shirov are synonyms for creative and exciting chess positions. In this game, it's going to be Chucky, Ivanchuk, who's going to drive this starship to planet Chucky with one of the most brilliant chess moves of all time, creating an irrational position in which he manages to overwhelm Shirov. This game features one of the most insane, sharp, and theoretical opening variations of all time, the Botvinnik variation of the semi-Slav defense. I really want to do a full series on Botvinnik games at some point, and I think I will in the near future. After pawn to e6 here, black has adopted this triangle setup, the semi-Slav structure here. It looks very solid, but the potential of this position is really exciting, and this leads to some of the sharpest and deepest opening lines in chess. Now, in this position, white has a choice. Are you going to play pawn to e3, which is still very interesting, playing to defend this pawn here and develop while closing in this bishop? Or are you going to try to get your bishop out with bishop g5 before you play pawn to e3? That's what's played in this game. This is the more ambitious move, trying to get everything you want in terms of piece placement. But by playing the bishop out, this is actually a pawn sacrifice, and black accepts the sacrifice with pawn takes on c4. Now, after pawn takes c4, white plays pawn to e4, trying to build a big, juicy, powerful center and to gain the pawn back. Black has already given up the center, so it's now important that you retain the pawn with pawn to b5. And now we are forced down a very interesting and forcing line. Pawn to e5, attacking the pin knight. Black must try to break the pin with h6 and then g5. You can't pull back because of knight d5, keeping the pawn and building a beautiful spot in the center for the knight. So after g5, sacrifice to maintain the pin right here. You're winning your piece back, but this line is just getting started. Knight steps up so that if the bishop captures, you can get rid of that really strong bishop, so the pawn captures instead. Black doesn't want to capture and walk into a pin. That will be too awkward in this position. Black instead should focus on development and getting castled on the queen side. Pawn g3, c5, opening up an attack on this rook here. d5, closing off that attack. Queen to b6, bishop g2. Both players are ready to castle and do castle in this position. And now b4, attacking the knight. This is move 15, and in a lot of ways, we are just getting started in this opening variation. Players who specialize in this line, grandmasters, they will actually have studied this line out maybe as deep as 50 or more moves in some critical and sharp in-game variations. So in this position, there's actually a decision. Do you play rook b1, which offers a piece sacrifice to open up the b file? Very interesting move. Or do you play knight to a4? That's what's played in this particular game. Either way, the play is very exciting. Now, queen to b5. And now pawn to a3, trying to open up the a file. And there's an interesting line here that I want to mention. For a while, it was thought that knight e5 was a good move. This move brings the knight to a strong square, and it tries to open up the rook and win the d5 pawn. But in this position, white can actually offer a sacrifice by trading on b4, playing queen d4 to attack the knight and the pawn, which looks really good. But then black has knight c6, which pulls the knight back and defends the pawn. However, after this, the line continues by sacrificing the queen. Pawn takes c6. Boom! White is giving up the queen for 2 pieces and a monster pawn on b7, and analysis has shown that after bishop e3, white has a really strong attack. It's not entirely clear if this variation is fully working for white in all lines, but it's a very dangerous attack. And I want you to hold on to the idea of giving up the queen for 2 pieces and a tremendous pawn on the 7th rank. That idea might loop around again. So, backing up here, after pawn to a3 in this position, we get pawn takes d5, a trade on b4, Bishop e3, attacking this pawn. Knight c5, blocking off that attack on a7 and developing your knight to a better square. And then queen g4 check. You don't want to go over to b8 because of queen d4, putting a lot of pressure on this diagonal and on the a7 square. So after queen g4 check, rook d7 was played, and this is a moment to pause. I encourage you to pause your video here and try and find what Ivanchuk played in this position, and I want you to use the maximum amount of imagination possible. Well, Ivanchuk actually played queen to g7. Boom! This is a tremendous, mind-blowing move, one of my favorite moves of all time. The queen sacrifices herself without even capturing anything. She just drops into the square on g7. White is going to ultimately get 2 minor pieces and a big pawn on the 7th rank for the queen. I told you to hold on to that idea. Even so, I find this an amazing queen sacrifice because I know this game. I've seen this game since I was a young player. I've played through it many times, and I've done it again for this video. I enjoy it every time, but every time I look at the positions that result after the queen sacrifice, I'm still kind of stunned that it actually works. There are some defenses that are available to black, but still, this queen sacrifice here is a very, very challenging and impressive idea, and the positions that result challenge my understanding of chess. So, after queen g7 here, we get bishop takes g7, pawn takes g7, the rook moves, trying to pick up that pawn, and now knight takes c5. This is a critical position here because it basically results by force after the queen sacrifice, and now black has to decide how to deal with all the problems. Basically, the compensation for white is revolving around the various threats aligned against the black queen side here. Also, white has the idea to try and hold on to the pawn on g7. And that pawn on g7 is tying down an entire rook in this position. So it's very difficult practically for black to deal with the pressure on the queen side and that strong pawn on g7. Deep analysis here has shown, though, that rook c7, and this was a game featuring Ponomarev, and then knight takes b7, rook takes b7, rook to d1, rook d7, and after bishop d4, f5 is a line that can work for black. The idea is by pushing the f-pawn up the board, you can sacrifice an exchange back on g7, eliminate the really powerful pawn on g7, and get a viable game. In fact, there are some other defenses for black that are maybe not quite as clearly effective as this one, but all of them really revolve around the idea of pushing f5 and trying to give back material to get rid of the pawn on g7. And if black does that, black can have a viable game. However, in this game, Shirov plays the move d4. Now, he actually has called this an oversight. Players have even called this a blunder. I don't think that's true because even though this is a provably wrong move, it takes a brilliant move from white several moves down the line to show the flaw in this position. Now, after d4 here, white plays bishop takes b7, the rook captures, and then knight takes b7. Now, this is a very interesting position. There's no time to capture this bishop because of knight to d6, giving a royal fork, picking up material, a lot of material. So after knight takes b7, because you also don't want to pull back when the bishop is a monster here and is attacking a7 and defending g7, and white has a stranglehold on the position, Shirov actually prepared queen to b6, pulling the queen back and hoping to pick up this knight or capture this bishop on the next turn and be better. It's a good idea, but now Ivanchuk has one move only, that not only maintains the advantage, but gives him a nearly winning position and puts Shirov under a huge amount of pressure. That is the move, bishop take d4. Boom! Again. This is the second really brilliant move in this game. It's not next to queen g7. This move might pale in comparison, That's only if you're comparing it to one of the greatest moves of all time. This is still a really stunning move. After bishop takes d4 here, the queen captures on d4, and then the rook goes to d1. In this position, the two rooks and the knight prove sufficient to overwhelm the black king with the threats. Now, in this position, black's queen is hit and needs to move. There are two pawns that are available to be captured. If queen takes g7, then rook takes a7 is a good idea, although black might be able to hold on here. King b8, rook to a1, and the brilliant try here, and I really think this is the last good try available to Ivanchuk, is rook to e8. And the point is to sacrifice the rook on e1 right here. And after rook e1 check, rook takes e1, king takes, knight takes c4. It looks like white is much better, but black has decent counterplay with, for example, queen to d4 in this position, and it's hard for white to make progress. I'm not sure if white is winning or if black has sufficient counterplay. In any case, that was definitely the best try. Instead, the move queen takes b2 was played, and I'm not sure if there's any defense anymore. So knight d6 check, king over to b8, rook d to b1, piling up pressure right here. If queen to c3, trying to hold on to this pawn and this pawn, we have rook takes a7, another really, really brilliant move. And if the king captures, you have a royal fork here, and white wins the rook endgame with ease. So, in all of this, we're backing up here. Now in this position, black plays the move queen takes g7, rook takes b4 check, king c7, attacking the knight. Another great move from Ivanchuk. Rook to a6, sliding up and defending the knight, and threatening rook to b7 here with mating ideas, and also various ideas to pick up material. In fact, in this position, there's only one pseudo defense for black, but it leads to a position in which black finds that there's nothing better to resign. That is rook to b8, rook takes check, and after the king takes the knight, rook takes b8. The computer only gives this plus 2.5 or thereabouts, and for a human player, I might suggest not resigning yet in a position like this, and generally plus 2.5 isn't something that would make me choose to resign, but after a few more moves, Ivanchuk did resign in this position, and I think that the basic point here is that the evaluation, although it's still about the same, is not really indicating the full story here. For two strong players, it's easy to appreciate that although the material is not yet hopeless for black, eventually the rooks come together and attack the c-pawn. When they get coordinated, which is inevitable, and they capture the pawn on c4, that liquidation is just going to lead to a winning position for white, and he's eventually going to push the pawn up the board over there. And there's no counterplay against the white king or anything, so in this position, faced with that basic idea, we did see Shirov resign the game. This is a stunning game. I hope you enjoyed it, especially the move queen to g7. If you want to see more of my favorite games of the 1990s or the 2000s, you can click on the playlists that are sitting on top of the screen.